Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a region of space that sits at the galaxy's edge, like a wound that never closes. Sailors who get too close say they can feel it before they can see it. A pressure behind the eyes, a low, grinding sensation in the back teeth. The sense that the darkness between stars has grown somehow thicker, more aware. The instruments aboard ship begin to behave oddly, fluctuating between impossible readings. The Geller field that keeps the warp out flickers at the edge of perception, as a faint shimmer visible to anyone standing near the hull, like a soap bubble that has developed an awareness of its own fragility. Then, as the light of familiar stars begins to bend and warp, and the colors bleed out of everything around the ship, they understand. They have drifted too close to the eye of terror. Navigators, those mutant humans with the third eye that allows them to perceive the warp and guide ships through it, will not go near the eye without specific, detailed, coerced instruction. Their third eye, when turned toward that region, experiences something that has been described in the fragmented classified testimonies compiled by the Inquisition as akin to looking directly into an enormous furnace that is also a thinking thing. Not a thing that thinks about them specifically, not at first. Just an enormous, yet incomprehensible fire of consciousness that does not care about them in the way that a wave does not care about the specific grain of sand it swallows. But the eye does notice, eventually, the way all terrible things notice when something small and edible gets close enough. Within that vast scar, in reality, 20,000 light-years wide and older than any living memory, the rules that govern everything else in the universe simply cease to apply. Time becomes meaningless. Our thought and matter blur into one another. Planets drift through skies that have no suns, lit instead by burning phenomena that cannot be named or classified. And on those planets, things live. Humans, mutants, creatures that were once one and are now something else entirely, all of them going about the brutal business of daily existence on worlds where existence itself has been warped into something unrecognizable. These are the demon worlds, are the demon. And today, we are going to spend a very long time in them. Welcome to Q on 40k. Settle in, get comfortable, and take a slow breath. What we are about to explore is not the kind of lore you rush through. This is the kind of lore that builds and layers and sits with you long after the screen goes dark. Get your drink, get your blanket, and let the quiet settle around you, because we are going somewhere that does not reward rushing. Our demon worlds are among the most elaborately realized corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. They represent the endpoint of corruption, the thing that Imperial citizens are terrified will happen to their own world if the wrong prayers get answered. They are alien, they are horrifying, and they are, in a very strange and deeply uncomfortable way, utterly fascinating. Because while these are places of almost inconceivable suffering, they are also places where human beings live, love, scheme, compete, worship, and occasionally even hope. The fact that such things can exist at all in these conditions tells us something profound about the tenacity of the human spirit, even when that spirit has been bent and broken and twisted into shapes we might not want to recognize. Today, we are going to visit 5 of the most well-documented Daemon worlds in the lore. We will walk through Medrengard, the iron prison planet of the Iron Warriors, where a black sun hangs in a white sky above fortresses that span continents. We will breathe the thick miasmic air of the Plague Planet, Mortarion's loving recreation of the toxic world that made him, where disease is currency and suffering is faith. We will venture underground on Sicarus, the Word-Bearer's temple world, where millions of slaves build cathedrals that have already buried themselves in their own devotion. We will stand in the storms of Sortiarius, the planet of sorcerers, but where knowledge is the only currency, and every captive psyker knows their mind is being slowly consumed. And we will look out at the sea of blood on Drakasi, where every city has an arena, every citizen is either a gladiator or a spectator, and mercy is not a concept that has survived. But before we walk into any of these specific places, we need to understand what a demon world is at its foundation, what it feels like to live on one in a general sense, and what the universe looks like when the laws of physics have been quietly replaced by something far more subjective and far more cruel: the architecture of damnation. What makes a world a demon world? The simplest way to explain a demon world is this. It is a planet where the warp and the material universe have become so entangled that neither exists in its original form anymore. The veil between them, that fragile membrane that, in normal space, what keeps nightmares contained to the dimension they belong to, has been shredded. What remains is something in between, a place that is real enough to stand on, but not real enough to be bound by the laws of physics. And because the warp is not a physical dimension, but a psychic one, a dimension made of thought, emotion, desire, and fear, what replaces physical law on a demon world is something far more personal. The environment reflects the dominant consciousness that rules it, or the landscape is shaped by the demon prince that claims it, their personality and obsessions literally sculpting the terrain the way tectonic forces shape mountains in normal space. But it is also shaped by the emotions of the mortal inhabitants, whose collective fears and hopes and devotions bleed outward into a world that has no defense against such things anymore. The most powerful psychers in the Imperium have occasionally caught glimpses of demon worlds through their visions, and in the descriptions they record before going irrevocably mad, paint a picture that is consistent in its wrongness. There are worlds that are flat like vast dinner plates, their edges dissolving into mist that leads nowhere. There are tiered worlds, rising in great steps like enormous staircases, each level a different climate, a different sky, a different set of physical rules. There are worlds where the sky itself is alive, where enormous faces drift overhead in the clouds, where lightning storms speak in voices that are almost intelligible, almost recognizable as words. What they all share is a sense that the world is watching you, that it is aware of you in the way a predator is aware of prey, that every mountain and valley and dark river has an opinion about your presence, and that opinion is rarely charitable. For the mortal populations of these worlds, this awareness is not a philosophical abstraction. It is the basic texture of daily life. But you wake up in a place that may look slightly different from how it looked when you went to sleep. The path you walked yesterday may simply not exist today, replaced by a ravine you have no memory of. The sky may have changed color in the night, not gradually the way weather works, but all at once, as if someone threw a switch somewhere. And the creatures that live in the dark spaces between structures, the things that flicker at the edge of your vision, they are not metaphors for your fear. So they are something that ate your fear and grew fat on it, and now wants more. Time does not behave properly in the eye of terror. The most well-documented example of this is the consistent experience reported by explorers and captives who enter the eye and return, a phenomenon that has never been satisfactorily explained by any branch of imperial science, though the Inquisition has tried. An individual might spend what feels like a week inside the eye, and return to find that years or even decades have passed in real space. Or the opposite, they may spend what feels like years in there, aging and changing and accumulating memories of a long ordeal, and step back out to find that only hours have elapsed. Time, inside the eye, is another thing that bends to will rather than fact. And on demon worlds specifically, where the warp's influence is at its most concentrated, the distortion is worst. Dates become meaningless. Calendars become fiction. Yet the mortal populations of demon worlds have generally stopped trying to track time in any conventional sense. Instead, they mark existence by events. The last great battle, the last period of calm before the sky turned red, the last time the ground stopped shifting. Their sense of duration is entirely experiential, and since experience on a demon world is neither consistent nor reliable, their relationship to history is often deeply strange. As old men who look 60 might be 300 years old, Children born last year might have memories they cannot account for. Communities that have existed for centuries might have no record of those centuries, because everyone who could have recorded them has been driven mad, converted into something inhuman, or simply stopped being able to perceive the passage of time in any sequential way. All of this, and we have not even begun to talk about the actual inhabitants yet. Let us start there. That's before the fall, the last ordinary day. Every demon world was, at some point, something else. A hive world, an agri world, a forge world, a frontier colony. A place where ordinary human beings woke up every morning, complained about their jobs, worried about their children, argued about politics, and went to sleep without any reasonable expectation that the laws of physics might not be there in the morning. The process by which a world becomes a demon world is not always sudden. Sometimes it is shockingly fast. A sufficiently powerful warp rift can consume a world in days, the sky cracking open, the ground heaving as immaterial forces pour through into reality, demons manifesting in living rooms and marketplaces and places of worship, the population either slaughtered or converted, or simply subsumed into the churning tide of the Imperium. When it happens this way, there is no gradual adjustment. One morning you are alive and recognizably human. By the end of that same day, the question of what constitutes human is no longer clear, but often the process is slower. A chaos cult takes root in the deep places of a society, in the underhive, in the slums, in the desperate communities where imperial authority has grown thin and imperial faith has grown hollow. The cult grows. Strange things begin to happen in the neighborhoods where it is most active. Machinery behaves oddly, animals go missing, and psychers begin having experiences they cannot explain. The Astronomicon, that vast psychic beacon generated by the Emperor himself that allows ships to navigate the warp, grows dimmer, less reliable, in the region around that world. Then there is an uprising, a summoning, an act of concentrated devotion that crosses some threshold and tears the veil just enough to let something through. What makes the slow corruption so insidious is that it tends to happen in places where the people least equipped to fight it are the ones who encounter it first. The underhive of a hive world, where the Arbites patrol only when they must, and the Adeptus Ministorum maintains only token presence, where the people have every earthly reason to resent the order that puts the Spire nobles in comfort and them in filth. A chaos cult that arrives here with promises of power, of revenge, of being seen and valued by forces more responsive than the Emperor's distant bureaucracy, is offering something that genuinely addresses genuine grievances. The cult fills a hole in people's lives that the Imperium put there by being exactly as harsh and indifferent as the Imperium is. This is the specific genius and the specific poison of the way chaos operates. It does not need to lie about everything. It only needs to offer something real, attention, community, and the sense of participating in something larger than yourself, while concealing what those things ultimately cost. What comes through shapes everything that follows. If it is a greater demon of corn, the world becomes a charnel house. Violence becomes not just common, but structural, the governing principle of all social organization. If it is a force of Nurgle, disease begins to remake the landscape, the air, the biology of every living thing within reach. If it is a sentient entity, the world begins to shift in subtler and more sinister ways. Reality, developing cracks and inconsistencies that slowly widen until nobody can be certain what is real anymore. By the time Imperial authority could respond, assuming it is even aware of what has happened, the world is already gone, not destroyed. Still there, still orbiting its star, if it still has one, if that star still behaves like a star, still covered with buildings and roads and the physical remnants of civilization. But everything that made it an imperial world has been overwritten. The governor's palace has become something else. The great temple to the emperor is either rubble or worse, intact, but repurposed for something that would make its original architects weep. The people are still there, but they are not the same people, and they would not recognize the former versions of themselves in any meaningful way. This is what makes demon worlds so philosophically disturbing. Thus, they are not empty of human life, they are full of it, and that life continues, in its broken and remade forms, for as long as the demon world exists. The suffering of a demon world is not a one-time event. It is ongoing, persistent, self-replenishing. Every generation born into it is born into the conditions created by all the generations that suffered before them, and they will pass those conditions along, perhaps made worse, to the generations that come after. Think about that for a moment. Or think about what it would mean to be born on one of these worlds, and to know, because knowledge of what your world is would be inescapable, that this is simply the condition of existence, that the sky is supposed to be that color, that the things that move in the dark are simply part of the landscape, that your body's mutations are the natural order of things, the same way humans in the Imperium, except that some people are born taller than others, or with different colored eyes. That normalization of the impossible is perhaps the most insidious thing about demon worlds. Not the suffering, which is immense, but the way in which the survivors of that suffering eventually stop experiencing it as suffering at all, and start experiencing it as simply the way things are. And in doing so, they become the most valuable resource their demonic rulers possess. Not just bodies to be thrown into battle, but true believers. People who do not serve chaos out of fear or desperation, but out of genuine, bone-deep, generation-deep conviction that this is correct, that this is how reality should work, that the universe before the demon world's fall was the aberration, and this is the truth. There is also the question of what the chaos gods themselves get from all of this. Not just the combat and the sacrifice and the worship, but the sustained presence of living populations on their worlds. The answer is psychic energy, the emotion that mortal beings generate, fear, pain, devotion, despair, ecstasy, rage, is the literal fuel that sustains the chaos god's presence and power in the warp. A world full of people experiencing intense emotion is a power source. It is not coincidental that the four major chaos gods each encourage extremely intense emotional states in their worshippers, not the mild, sustainable pleasures of a comfortable life, but the peak experiences of terror, agony, rapturous devotion, and explosive rage. These produce the most concentrated and most potent psychic emissions. A demon world, full of people in constant, intense emotional states by the nature of their conditions, is essentially an emotion generator running at maximum capacity 24 hours a day, day after day, century after century. This is the real economy of the Eye of Terror, the real resource. The suffering itself, translated into psychic energy, feeding the entities whose existence depends on exactly this kind of fuel. We will return to that psychology later. Right now, let us get specific. Medrengard, life in the iron prison. Imagine a sky that is the color of bleached bone, so white it hurts to look at, so uniformly pale that it provides no warmth, no comfort, no sense of direction, and hanging in that white sky, a sun that is black, not dark, not dim, black. A perfect void suspended in brilliance. Pouring out not light but something else. Smoky threads of darkness that drift down from it like inverted rain, settling over the world below with a weight that is not quite physical but never quite not physical either. Those threads are said to carry something. The souls of those who have died here, some say. The concentrated will of the world's master, others claim. Whatever they are, they make the shadows strange on Medrengard. And they make the sunlight, if you can call it that, feel like standing under something that is watching rather than illuminating. This is the first thing you would notice. Not the fortresses, not the slaves, not the constant distant sound of industry that never, ever stops. The sky. Because the sky of Medrengard is the most direct expression of what this world is and what it has been made to become. It is the sky of a place where order has been taken to its logical conclusion, and found to be indistinguishable from cruelty. Medrengard is the demon world of the Iron Warriors, the traitor legion that was once the Imperium's greatest siege engineers. In the age before the Horus Heresy, the Iron Warriors fought the wars that nobody else could fight. The grinding, attritional campaigns against planetary defenses that could withstand orbital bombardment. The assaults on fortress monasteries that had withstood siege for centuries. The reduction of fortified positions that other legions simply could not crack. They were brilliant at it, and they were rewarded for their brilliance in the way the Imperium often rewards such things. By being used constantly, sent to the worst postings, given the most thankless work, never quite receiving the glory that other legions accumulated in more cinematically heroic campaigns. Their Primarch, Perturabo, was brilliant and bitter and deeply, constitutionally, unable to let go of perceived slights. He felt undervalued because he was undervalued. He felt trapped because he was, in many practical senses, trapped in a role the Imperium would never allow him to leave. When the Horus Heresy offered him the chance to express that bitterness in the most violent possible way, he did not hesitate for long. As what he eventually created on Medrengard is a world that reflects both what the Iron Warriors are and what they have become. The entire surface of the planet has been built over, not partially, entirely. There is no natural landscape remaining on Medrengard because the Iron Warriors and their slaves have been covering it with fortifications for 10,000 years. And what the fortifications have not covered, the industry has. The world is a planet-sized fortress, and a single enormous construction project that has never been completed because completion was never the point. The point is the building. The point is the eternal application of Iron Warriors' doctrine, the reduction, the siege, the building of defenses against attacks that may never come, applied not to an enemy's world, but to their own. The fortresses of Medrengard are not uniform. They are the projects and territories of individual warsmiths, the Iron Warriors' equivalent of commanders, each of whom maintains a section of the planet according to their own specific obsessions and doctrines. Warsmith Honsu's fortress citadel of Kalangol, the most extensively documented of these in the historical record, is a good example of what a Medrengard stronghold looks like from the perspective of the people who live and die inside it. It is a place of layered walls and underground chambers, of industry that grinds continuously without any clear purpose beyond the demonstration of capacity, of hierarchy, enforced not through law, but through the constant, ever-present threat of violence from above. The walls of these fortresses stretch for kilometers. They are not beautiful in the way that cathedrals are beautiful, not even in the grim, utilitarian way of imperial fortress worlds. Yet they are beautiful in the way that mathematics is beautiful, in their efficiency, their exactness, the precise relationship between height and thickness and angle that makes them nearly impossible to breach without specific knowledge of their specific weaknesses. And every warsmith knows the weaknesses of every other warsmith's fortifications, because they all built using the same doctrine, the same Iron Warriors principles. This means that the eternal low-level warfare between rival warsmiths on Medrengard is as much intellectual as it is physical, a constant competition of who can find the gap in whose design, who can adapt faster, who can rebuild what was destroyed in time to destroy what is being built. There is a specific psychological torment built into this dynamic that the Iron Warriors themselves may not fully recognize in themselves, though their Primarch presumably does. And they are the galaxy's greatest builders of fortifications. They know, with absolute technical certainty, that any fortification can be breached with sufficient knowledge, patience, and force. They know this because they are the ones who breach them. So every fortress they build on Medrengard is built by people who are fully aware of every possible method of its eventual destruction, who know exactly which angles of approach are most vulnerable, at which points in the wall are the relative weaknesses, how long it would take a well-equipped and well-informed attacker to reduce this specific structure to rubble. They build anyway. They build knowing this. The building is not an act of hope. It is an act of defiance against the certainty of destruction, which is perhaps the most Iron Warriors thing imaginable. Every wall they raise is an argument made in stone against a conclusion they already know is inevitable. But the mortal population of Medrengard serves this process as raw material. They are slaves, but not in the simple sense of prisoners who have been put to work. They are slaves in the specific, particular way that the Iron Warriors require. Laborers for the construction projects, workers for the demon forges that produce the weapons and armor the Legion needs for its campaigns, fodder for the experiments that the more arcane warsmiths conduct in the deeper chambers of their fortresses. At the social structure of this slave population, such as it is, operates on a brutal meritocracy. Those who work well and survive long enough accumulate small advantages. Slightly better rations, slightly more protected sleeping quarters, slightly less likelihood of being randomly selected for the more lethal experimental projects. Those who fail, or who are too slow or who catch the wrong kind of attention are reassigned to worse duties, which on Medrengard is a sliding scale that can go significantly lower than you might initially imagine. The slave population of Medrengard is not homogeneous. It is assembled from hundreds of worlds across thousands of years of raiding, which means the cultural backgrounds present in the slave quarters of a single warsmith's fortress might include descendants of hive welders, farm laborers from agri-worlds, tech priests who have been forcibly stripped of their augmetics and put to work, using only the residual knowledge in their unaugmented minds, soldiers from Imperial Guard regiments captured in battle who have been fighting in the only way available to them by surviving for decades. This creates communities of extraordinary linguistic and cultural complexity, communities where the shared language of the enslaved has become a creole of dozens of different traditions, or where the practical knowledge accumulated from this enormous range of backgrounds has made the slave population collectively far more technically capable than anyone in the Iron Warriors hierarchy acknowledges or wants to acknowledge. Because here is the thing about Medrengard's slave population. They build the fortresses, not the Iron Warriors. Was not primarily. Chaos Space Marines make exceptional warriors, but they are expensive to use for anything as prosaic as laying stone and mixing mortar and running conduit through walls. The slaves build Medrengard, have built it for 10,000 years, and the best of them have accumulated, across generations, a deep and sophisticated understanding of Iron Warriors' fortification doctrine. They know the principles, they know the standard configurations, they know where the weaknesses typically are, because they were the ones who built those weaknesses into the walls because the structural calculations demanded it. This knowledge is not nothing. In the wrong circumstances, from the Iron Warrior's perspective, it could be quite dangerous. Well, the fact that it never is, the fact that the slaves never leverage this knowledge toward their own liberation in any systematic way, is partly a function of the surveillance and the violence that prevents coordination, and partly a function of the deep psychological adaptation we discussed earlier. The people who know the most about Medrengard's fortifications are the people who have lived their entire lives being told in every possible way that their knowledge exists to serve others and not themselves. At the very bottom of the slave hierarchy are those assigned to the most dangerous construction work, the repairs to the outer walls during or after siege operations, where Iron Warriors' artillery is still firing, and the margins between life and death are measured in centimeters. Below even them, in terms of survival probability, are those selected for the experimental programs that various warsmiths run. Yet the most notorious of these, documented extensively in the aftermath of Ultramarine Captain Uriel Ventris's mission to Medrengard in the late 41st Millennium, was a program called the Daemon. The Daemon was the creation of warsmith Honsu, himself an unusual figure among the Iron Warriors, bearing gene seed that had been corrupted with material from an Imperial Fists apothecary during the Horus Heresy, which made him a figure of contempt among his pure-blooded peers. Perhaps because of that contempt, Honsu was driven to prove something, to build something the other warsmiths could not. The Daemon was his answer to a fundamental problem the Iron Warriors faced. They had no apothecaries to harvest gene seed from fallen battle brothers, no way to create new Iron Warriors through the conventional process, and their numbers were slowly declining through attrition. The Daemon was the dark Mechanicus solution to this problem, and it requires significant restraint to describe calmly. Human female slaves were taken and force-fed concentrated nutrients until their bodies bloated and swelled to grotesque proportions. Their physiology altered through a combination of forbidden surgery and chaos sorcery to serve as something between an incubator and a reactor. Stolen gene seed, taken from the vaults of the Imperial fists on the world of Hydra Caudatus, was implanted into them. Then adolescent boys, they taken from anywhere the Iron Warriors could acquire them, were sealed inside these living wombs and left to undergo a transformation that would, in theory, produce new Iron Warriors. The process failed as often as it succeeded, and the failures were catastrophic. A successful outcome produced a Chaos Space Marine, skinless at first, because the process destroyed the outer layers, who was then wrapped in flesh harvested from other slaves. Just a procedure whose details I will leave to your imagination. An unsuccessful outcome produced something else, something that fell out into the world through the fortress's drainage systems, surviving through sheer biological drive, eventually finding others like itself in the wastes beyond the walls. The Iron Warriors called them the Unfleshed, and the name is descriptive enough. Enormous, disfigured, without skin, was driven partly by instinct and partly by something more complicated, because the Daemon did not strip humanity entirely from its failures. The Unfleshed retained enough to feel things, to recognize kin, to form something like community in the blasted wastes of Medrengard. Extraordinarily, and in a way that says something quietly devastating about the nature of faith. Yes, the Unfleshed built crude effigies of the Emperor from scrap metal and worshipped him in the wastes outside the fortress that had made them. Even in that place, even as those things, something reached for the divine. Ventress's mission saw the Daemon destroyed and the Unfleshed freed. But Honsu survived, rebuilt, and Medrengard continues. The black sun still hangs in its bone-white sky. The Daemon forges still grind. Somewhere in the deep chambers of Kalangol or 100 other fortress citadels, other experiments are running. Other slaves are serving the eternal building project, the fortress world that is never finished, the siege that is always both conducted and endured. What is daily life like for a long-term resident of Medrengard, beyond the obvious horrors? The accounts we have, fragmentary and largely derived from Ventress's experiences and the records his mission produced, suggest something that might be surprising, a degree of dark familiarity. The slaves of Medrengard are not in constant screaming panic. They are, in the way of people everywhere who have adapted to impossible conditions, going about their work. They have routines. They have hierarchies within their communities that serve social functions, adjudicating minor disputes, distributing resources, maintaining whatever small threads of culture survive in a place like this. They tell stories, and stories about escape attempts, most of which end badly. Stories about individual warsmiths, about their specific cruelties and their occasional calculated moments of leniency. Because even Iron Warriors understand that a slave who believes they might survive is a more productive slave than one who has abandoned all hope. They know which chambers to avoid, which warsmiths' territories are safer to work in, which shifts are more likely to result in being selected for something terrible. This is not hope, exactly, but it is not despair either. It is something more resilient and more troubling than either. The human capacity for adaptation taking hold in a place that should be beyond adaptation, building the routines and structures that make endurance possible, because endurance is the only thing that is possible. Above the slaves, the Iron Warriors themselves exist in a state of perpetual, grinding political warfare. The relationship between rival warsmiths on Medrengard is one of the most complex social structures in the Eye of Terror. A combination of formal deference to a shared doctrine and ideology, informal competition for resources and territory, and occasional outright military conflict when the balance shifts far enough. They respect Perturabo, their demon primarch, was in the complicated way that children of abusive parents sometimes respect the force that shaped them. It is as much fear as admiration, as much resentment as genuine loyalty. He is rarely directly involved in the day-to-day politics of his fortress world. He dwells in his own domain, deeper and darker than any warsmith's citadel, contemplating the mathematics of fortification and the architecture of suffering with equal attention. The sound of Medrengard, if you could somehow listen to the whole world at once, would be the sound of industry, of metal being worked, of explosions in the middle distance that might be construction or might be conflict. And the distinction matters less here than it would anywhere else, of things being built that will eventually be torn down and built again. The cycle of construction and destruction that is both the Iron Warriors' doctrine and their curse, playing out on a planetary scale forever, yet in the shadow of a black sun that has forgotten what it means to give warmth. The Plague Planet, where sickness is a form of grace. On the Plague Planet, also called munificence by those few who feel something like affection for it, the first thing that hits you is the smell. There is no preparation for it and no description that does it justice, but we can try. Imagine everything that has ever rotted or festered or decayed, concentrated into an atmospheric phenomenon, carried on air so thick with biological material that breathing it feels like drinking. Imagine that this air also carries spores, billions of them, some alive, some dormant, some that are both and neither at the same time, each one a potential vector for any of the thousands of engineered diseases that Mortarion and his Death Guard have spent 10,000 years developing and refining and releasing into the population. But here is the extraordinary thing, up for the mortals who live here, and there are many, pressed into the villages and valleys and rotting forests between the world's enormous artificial mountains. That smell is not unpleasant. It is home. It is the smell of Nurgle's presence, of grandfather's attention, of the world's specific form of grace. They have been breathing this air since before they could speak. Their immune systems were overwhelmed and then rebuilt along different lines before they were old enough to understand what an immune system was. The plagues that would kill an outsider in hours are, for the long-term residents of the Plague Planet, simply the conditions of existence. They are alive inside them, carrying dozens of diseases simultaneously, their bodies in a constant state of decay and renewal, and they experience this, most of them, most of the time, not as suffering, but as connection. This is the specific horror and the specific genius of Nurgle's domain. The Plague Planet was not always what it is. Before the fall of the Eldar, that catastrophic moment, approximately 10,000 years ago, when the birth of the Chaos god Slanesh tore open the Eye of Terror and consumed the heart of a galaxy-spanning civilization, this world was called Eliathida. It's an Eldar world whose name translates in various places as either the Sublime Soul Garden, the Prideful Wasteland, or the Dry Valley of Dreams. What it looked like then is lost. The Eldar are not willing to describe it, but whatever it was consumed by the cataclysm that created the Eye, stripped of all its former life, and left as a bare canvas in the new psychic geography of that impossible region. While when Mortarion's Death Guard retreated into the Eye after the collapse of the Horus Heresy, they found this world and claimed it. And Mortarion, consciously or not, deliberately, or as an expression of something too deep to be fully conscious, began to remake it in the image of the place that had made him. Barbarus was Mortarion's original homeworld, at the world where he had been abandoned in infancy and found by a warlord who used him as a weapon against the human population of the planet's lower zones. It was a death world with a permanently toxic atmosphere. Clouds of lethal chemicals drifted at mid-elevation, below which the humans struggled to survive, above which the alien warlords maintained their fortresses, protected by the poison that killed everything else.
Before we keep going, I want to take a second and just be honest with you. This is one of those topics I kept putting off making a video about because I genuinely wasn't sure I could do it justice. Demon worlds aren't just horror set dressing in 40k. They're the setting's argument, the place where all the philosophical weight of this universe lands in the most concentrated form. When I started actually reading through the lore for this, the Demon Collaba stuff, the way Dracassi's whole society is structured around the arena, I had to stop for a few minutes and just sit with it. Not because it's upsetting in a simple way, but because it's well thought out. Whoever built these words cared about what they were saying, and I think that deserves more than just a surface level, here are the scary things run through. So that's what I'm trying to give you here. I hope it lands the way I intended it to, but anyways, let's go back to the video.
Mortarion had grown up in that atmosphere, had become immune to it. B had used that immunity as his first weapon in the long rebellion that eventually saw him overthrow the warlords who had ruled from above and subjugate the very population he had once tried to protect. When the Emperor arrived and took Mortarion from Barbarus, the slightest implication was that the Emperor had finished what Mortarion could not, killed the final warlord when Mortarion's augmented body had still been too weak, too poisoned to complete the job. Mortarion never forgave this. That the Emperor had stolen his revenge, his proof that he was sufficient, that he needed no one. The bitterness of that theft coiled in him for centuries, and it was that specific bitterness, combined with the agonies of the destroyer plague aboard his legion's ships, becalmed in the warp on the way to Terra, that made Mortarion's bargain with Nurgle feel not like a betrayal, but like a homecoming. And so, on the plague planet, he built Barbarus again. Oh, the mountains are not natural. They are artificial constructions of warp-infused matter, coaxed into being over millennia, so numerous and so densely packed that from orbit the world looks like a hedgehog, every surface bristling with peaks. At the summit of the greatest of these peaks, the 7 fortress keeps of the Death Guard's plague companies maintain their stations, just as the alien warlords of Barbarus maintained their fortresses above the toxic clouds. Mortarion himself occupies the Black Manse, a structure of such scale that it stretches between the 3 highest peaks of the world, so large it can be seen from orbit, its silhouette forming the 3-lobed symbol of Nurgle when viewed from above. It is also called the Whispering Tower, because its corridors carry a constant low sound that is not quite wind and not quite voices. Inside it, in libraries that drip with filth, in corridors that moan when the air moves through them. As Mortarion keeps his most precious things, forbidden tomes, cryptoscience texts, numerological treatises, and above all the 7 books of woe, volumes whose covers weep with some unidentifiable fluid, and whose pages, it is said, make sounds when turned. The sound of a corpse shifting. Deep beneath the Black Manse, in vaults that not even the Death Guard's own plague marines are permitted to enter, without Mortarion's personal authorization, as are the gene seed stocks of the Legion, the biological heritage of 10,000 years of Death Guard Astartes, preserved in conditions that are neither sterile nor entirely physical, kept in a state that maintains their potency through processes. The Dark Mechanicus priests, who tend them, understand only partially. There is another structure on the plague planet worth noting, the Peel Yard, a fortified forge standing in the deep swamps, echoing with a relentless clamour that has not ceased in anyone's living memory. It is here that the toxins of misery are made. Enormous bells, worn by the Death Guard's noxious blightbringers, forged at the very edge of the warp itself, their metal incorporating the crystallized suffering of dying psychers, inscribed with runes that resonate with specific frequencies of despair. The demon smiths who work in the Peel Yard are strange even by plague planet standards. They drone continuously as they work, a sound that has over centuries become indistinguishable from the clamour of the forges, so that visitors to the area cannot tell where the machine noise ends and the human sound begins, which is perhaps the point. Below the peaks, in the valleys between the artificial mountains, the mortal population cowers in what can generously be described as villages. These are collections of structures made from whatever materials have survived the disease and decay that transform everything on this world. Rotting wood, corroded metal, biological matter that has been incorporated into walls and floors and roofs, in ways that blur the line between construction and growth. The soil of the plague planet is alive in the specific, uncomfortable way of a wound that is still processing. The rainfall is warm and viridian-tinged, yet carrying in suspension the biological material of the plague planet's atmosphere, equal parts nourishment and infection, and the residents who run for cover when the rain begins do so automatically, the way children learn to flinch before they understand what flinching prevents. The inhabitants of these villages are diseased in the specific, comprehensive way of people who have never been anything else. Bloated limbs, patches of skin that have taken on unusual colors or textures, as parasites that have become so thoroughly integrated into their host's biology that removing them would kill both parties. Eyes that have developed unusual properties as adaptations to seeing through the ever-present miasma. And through all of this, movement. They move, they work, they talk, especially about their diseases. Among the mortal inhabitants of the plague planet and the beastmen who share the world with them, the pestigors, are enormous mutant creatures who are as much livestock as they are people in the eyes of their masters. There is a specific social currency based on the severity and impressiveness of one's afflictions. A mortal who carries a disease that the plague marines find interesting, or one that has particularly spectacular symptoms, or one that has developed some novel interaction with another disease the carrier also has, occupies a position of genuine respect in village society. Us, the pestigors in particular, boast openly and enthusiastically about their conditions, comparing the colors of their suppurating wounds, the vigor of their parasites, the specific auditory qualities of the wet sounds their bodies make when they move. To be greatly diseased on the plague planet is to be greatly loved by Grandfather Nurgle. And to be greatly loved by Grandfather Nurgle is the highest aspiration available to the mortal population. They pray for more. This is the thing that is perhaps hardest to hold in your head. They pray for more disease, not less. When new plagues are released from the disease factories, vast subterranean complexes, staffed by millions of cultist laborers and governed by ancient blightspawn elders, places where foul blightspawn and biologus putrefiers work ceaselessly to engineer new forms of suffering to unleash on the wider galaxy, the villages welcome the arrival of new strains with something approaching festive anticipation. Will this be the plague that grants favor? Will this be the disease that attracts the eye of the Death Guard, perhaps leading to elevation, perhaps leading to something more? The ritual competitions on the iron platforms in the swamps, those great rusted triad structures where mortal tribal champions duel for the right to join the Death Guard, are a direct expression of this. They are not reluctant participants. They are burning with desire to prove themselves worthy. And the specific form that proof takes on the plague planet is the capacity to withstand, to absorb what would kill anything else and keep walking, to demonstrate, through sheer biological endurance, at the depth of Nurgle's investment in your continued existence. The champions who compete on these platforms are extraordinary specimens even by plague planet standards. Individuals who have survived things that killed everyone around them, who carry disease loads that would have long ago collapsed lesser biology, who have been tested by everything the world has thrown at them, and have kept walking regardless. They compete not with the intention of destroying their opponent, though destruction is an acceptable outcome, but with the intention of demonstrating that they can take more, endure more, outlast more. A champion who absorbs everything their opponent can inflict and keeps walking has won, whether their opponent is still alive or not. It is, in a very direct way, a competition of Nurgle's favor made physical, a demonstration, before an audience of Death Guard observers and the assembled villagers of the surrounding region, of exactly who the plague god loves best. The successful candidates do not immediately become plague marines. The Death Guard's gene seed operates under constraints even Nurgle's gifts cannot entirely circumvent. But they enter a period of transformation and testing, during which they receive increasing doses of Nurgle's attention in the form of specific, curated disease exposures, surgical modifications performed by foul blightspawn who have been doing this for centuries, and a gradual indoctrination into the Death Guard's specific theology and tactical doctrine. The ones who survive this process, and survival is the only measure that matters, are changed in ways that make the word survival feel slightly inadequate as a description. They are something else, something that was once mortal and is now plague marine, which is its own specific kind of entity that is neither fully alive nor fully dead, but instead locked in the particular equilibrium of Nurgle's embrace. The forests of the plague planet, those areas not dominated by mountains or factories or villages, are places of extraordinary and deeply wrong beauty. The trees are rot-blackened, their branches hosting colonies of things that are not quite insects and not quite something else. The soil moves, visibly, with the things that live in it. Pools of standing liquid that might be water, but is certainly not behave with a thick sluggishness that suggests they have been metabolized into something more complex. The light that filters through the miasmic cloud cover above is greenish and diffuse, casting no shadows in the conventional sense, creating instead a flat, murky illumination that makes everything visible and nothing bright. And through all of this, moving with the slow and unhurried confidence of creatures who have no natural predators, the enormous chaos spawn that Mortarion has banished here for various transgressions, some of them grown now to the size of hills, their mass incorporating the vegetation around them as they move in slow circuits that have worn visible paths in the landscape over the centuries. But the oldest of these spawn have been here so long that small ecosystems have developed on their surfaces, species of fungus and organism that exist nowhere else, that have evolved specifically to live on the backs of these moving mountains of corrupted flesh. On the plague planet, even the punished become part of the cycle. What do the mortal inhabitants fear? Not disease, not the beasts, not even death in the conventional sense. Because death on the plague planet is not an ending, but a transition. The body's decay feeding back into the great cycle of rot and renewal that Nurgle governs. The soul's passage into something that is definitely not peace, but is not quite oblivion either. What they fear is disfavor. The sense that their patron has turned his attention elsewhere, that their suffering has become routine rather than noteworthy, that they are decaying without anyone paying attention. The fear is of being forgotten. In a universe as enormous and as indifferent as the 41st Millennium, even a dark and nauseating form of divine attention is preferable to none. Sycharis, the temple that buried itself, stands somewhere underground, not in a basement or a cellar, somewhere properly underground, hundreds of meters beneath the surface, where the weight of everything above you is a constant physical presence you can feel in your back and your lungs, and the particular quality of the air, which is old and close and recycled so many times that it carries the biochemical traces of every breath that has ever been drawn in that space. That is the default condition of the mortal population of Sycharis. Sycharis is a world that has buried itself under its own devotion, and the word-bearers arrived in the Eye of Terror after the Horus Heresy, and chose this world for reasons that are not entirely recorded, perhaps for its particular position in the Eye, perhaps because of something in its psychic geography that resonated with Lorgar's specific vision of what chaos worship should look like, perhaps simply because it was there and they needed somewhere to be. What they found was a world that could become what Lorgar dreamed of. What they created is something that not even Lorgar perhaps fully intended. The sky of Sycharis is a roiling canopy of fire and blood. Not metaphorically. The atmosphere of the world has been transformed by 10,000 years of warp influence into a churning, luminous mass of burning gases and vapor that carries in it the visible energies of the ruinous powers, so that looking up from Sycharis's surface is like looking into a furnace that is also somehow alive, and that pulses and contracts and expands with what feels uncomfortably like breathing. It provides light after a fashion. It provides heat after a fashion. It provides absolutely no comfort. Below this sky, the surface of Sycharis has been completely covered with architecture. not built over, the way Medringard is built over, constructed. Every square meter of the original surface is under a structure dedicated to the worship of chaos. And every one of those structures has more structures built on top of it, and more on top of those, the entire world, a single, enormous, accumulated act of devotion that has been going on for 10,000 years and shows no sign of stopping. The obelisks that project above the uppermost layer of construction reach several kilometers into that roiling, terrible sky. Each one a needle of black stone or corrupted ceramite or some material that has no name, yet each one lined with spikes and hooks and the biological remnants of offerings, each one buzzing at a frequency that human ears cannot quite hear, but human nervous systems definitely register. The Basilica of the Word, the central fortress cathedral, where the Dark Council of Dark Apostles makes its decisions about the direction of the entire Word-Bearers Legion, is crowned with hundreds of these spires, each one 5 kilometers high. And on each spike, on every jagged projection of each spire, there are living things. The sacrifices are not dead. They are pinned, secured, impaled, and they are alive, and they have been alive for as long as their biology permits before the world's ambient warp energy either grants them an unpleasant form of extended existence or finally allows their bodies to fail. This is not a momentary statement, a single act of worship. This is a permanent feature of the landscape, a maintained and refreshed and attended to by the cultist population that serves the word-bearers. There are people whose entire professional function is to ensure that the living sacrifices on the basilica's spires remain living, because a corpse impaled on a spike is merely decoration. What the dark gods require is ongoing suffering, ongoing consciousness, ongoing witness to the power of the word-bearer's devotion. But almost nobody on Sycharis sees any of this directly. That's because almost nobody on Sycharis lives above ground. The original surface is buried under so many layers of construction that it cannot be reached anymore. The lower levels of Sycharis's architecture are the oldest, the most decrepit, and the most densely inhabited. A labyrinthine warren of interconnected chambers, collapsed corridors, makeshift communities built in the spaces between monumental architecture, tunnels carved through foundations. Its entire districts established in the cellars of structures that were themselves built on the cellars of older structures. Generations of mortals have been born and died in these lower levels without ever seeing the burning sky, have navigated entirely by the faint light that filters down through cracks in the floor above, by their own bioluminescent mutations, by the glow of small altars that burn with persistent dark flames. The mortal population of Sycharis is staggeringly large. Millions of people, perhaps hundreds of millions, crowded into the subterranean spaces of a world that was never intended to be a habitable world, but rather an enormous religious monument. They serve the word-bearers in the only currency the word-bearers genuinely value: faith and construction. Faith, because the word-bearers are more than any other traitor legion. A legion of believers. Lorgar's transformation from loyalist to heretic was not a cynical power grab, but a genuine theological conversion, and the institution he built reflects that. The word-bearers require their servants to genuinely believe, to practice their devotion with real feeling, because genuine faith has a different and more potent psychic signature than performed faith, and it is the psychic signature that matters. Yet the energy that flows from 1 billion people genuinely giving their souls to the ruinous powers is one of the most valuable resources in the Eye of Terror. Construction, because Sycharis is never finished. Spider-legged mechanical cranes, enormous, partly biological entities that serve as construction equipment, move continuously over the upper layers of the world, guided by word-bearers overseers. Building. Always building. More layers, more structures, more spires, more devotion made physical, a more faith made architectural. The mortals who work these cranes, who haul materials to the building sites, who mix the compounds used to adhere one layer of architecture to the next, work until they cannot work anymore. And when they cannot work anymore, they become materials. Their remains incorporated into the structures they were building, their blood used in the mortar, their bones sometimes visible in the walls of chambers they helped to construct. And somewhere on Sycharis, like in a structure whose exact location is not known even to the Dark Council, Lorgar himself sits. He has been sitting, or whatever the Demon Prince equivalent of sitting is, since the end of the Horus heresy. In the Templum Inficio, his personal temple, he has been in a state of meditation and study for 10,000 years, exploring the mysteries of chaos in such depth that even his own legion has stopped expecting to hear from him regularly. Whilst the word-bearers say this is a sign of his supreme devotion, his willingness to sacrifice even his direct involvement with his own legion for the sake of greater understanding. Perhaps. But it is also possible that Lorgar has simply found something in those depths that makes everything else, including his legion, including the Long War, including the political games of the Eye of Terror, seem trivial. He first fell in love with ideas, after all, with belief itself, and with the practice and architecture of faith. Perhaps he has found the deepest expression of those things and simply cannot look away. What this means for the mortal population of Sycharis is that they live in a world shaped entirely by a theology that its chief architect has withdrawn from. The Dark Council interprets Lorgar's will from a distance, issues doctrinal decisions based on 10,000-year-old instructions and their own best guesses, and governs a population that knows the name of its ruler the way the residents of most imperial worlds know the name of the emperor, as a vast and remote divine presence that is real in some ultimate sense, but entirely inaccessible in any practical one. Daily life in the sublevels of Sycharis has a strange, almost monastic quality. The rhythms of devotion, the required prayers at specific intervals, the hymns that echo up and down the corridors, as the ritual preparations for the monthly ceremonies that involve the upper levels and the selection of new sacrifices, structure the day in ways that the word calendar barely describes. It is more like a liturgy, a way of moving through time that is simultaneously oppressive and, for those born into it, genuinely comforting. The prayers are real. The people of Sycharis, for the most part, actually believe. They believe because they have no reference point for disbelief, but also because belief in this place is rationally justified in a way it almost never is. Here, the gods demonstrably exist, demonstrably respond, demonstrably shape the world around you. The question is not whether to believe. The question is only how to be worthy of the attention of what you believe in. Sortiarius, the planet of sorcerers. If Sycharis is a world of faith, Sortiarius is a world of knowledge. The distinction matters enormously to anyone who lives there. And the difference between those two orientations toward the supernatural shapes the specific flavor of dread that the planet of sorcerers generates. Sortiarius was not originally a demon world. It was a vacant, unnamed, warp-touched planet in the Eye of Terror. Unremarkable except for the fact that Sinch, the chaos god of change, knowledge, fate, and schemes within schemes within schemes, had apparently reserved it for future use. When Magnus the Red and the surviving warriors of the Thousand Suns arrived in the final moments of the Battle of Prospero, when the Space Wolves under Leman Russ were burning the Thousand Suns' home city, and Magnus had run out of options, he made a decision. He spoke a word of power. He transferred the entire city of Tizca, the Jewel of Prospero, the repository of 10,000 years of accumulated arcane knowledge, on the libraries and towers and pyramids of a civilization that valued learning above almost everything else, through the warp to this blank, barren world. The city of light became the city of ruin. Not immediately. The structures survived the transfer, their physical forms intact, but gradually, as the warp environment of the new world began to interact with everything the Thousand Suns had brought with them. The majestic spires distorted into angular obsidian shapes that catch the light wrong. And the pyramids sank into the volcanic ground until only their upper sections were accessible. The pillars that had lined Tizca's ceremonial avenues petrified and leaned at angles that should not be architecturally stable, but somehow hold. And above all of it, dwarfing every other structure on the world, the Tower of the Cyclops, Magnus's obsidian monolith, and topped by an eye that is not a metaphor, but a literal enormous sorcerous organ that can watch everything on the planet simultaneously and can extend its gaze through the warp to observe real space across light years. The landscape beyond the city is volcanic and hostile in ways that go beyond simple geology. The plains are flux plains, surfaces that shift and change as the warp energy saturating the world expresses itself, so that the same stretch of ground might be solid rock one day and something more uncertain the next. The skies are permanent storms of multicolored warp energy, low-hanging clouds that rain drops of empiric power into rivers and seas that are dark and wrong-colored and flow in ways that ordinary fluid dynamics cannot fully explain. Nothing natural grows on Sortiarius. The flora and fauna, such as they exist, are warp creatures, chaos hounds, creatures born of the ambient demonic energy, the things that are partly animal and partly idea. The mortal population of Sortiarius arrived in layers. The first layer were the prospering humans who had lived in Tizca before the fall, the servants and scholars and craftspeople of the great city, who came through the transfer along with everything else. In the 10,000 years since, their descendants have mutated, as everything mutates on a Tzinchian demon world, whilst in ways that trend toward increased psychic sensitivity and decreased conventional human morphology. Few of them look fully human anymore. Most have accumulated beast-man characteristics, avian features, additional limbs, feathered patches, eyes that see into spectrums that human eyes have no business seeing into. They are the Tzangors, and they occupy a peculiar middle position on Sortiarius. They are the natives, in the sense of having the longest connection to the world. But they are not the rulers, not the elite, and not entirely trusted. The second and more continuously refreshed layer of the mortal population are the captives brought back from raids into real space. The Thousand Sons are raiders of a very specific kind. They are not interested in territory or resources in the conventional sense. What they want is knowledge and psychic potential. When they raid an imperial world, they take scholars, psychers, and anyone whose mind contains something of value or whose gift with the warp marks them as potentially useful. These captives arrive on Sortiarius and enter the service of whatever Thousand Sons sorcerer has claimed them. Those with psychic ability become thrall wizards. This is not a gentle process of education. It is a binding, literal, specific, a sorceress that ties the new thrall wizard to their particular sorcerer's consciousness in ways that make resistance difficult and defection nearly impossible. In exchange for this permanent subjugation of their will, thrall wizards receive access to knowledge that would make any scholar in the Imperium weep with longing. The accumulated arcane learning of a civilization that has spent 10,000 years studying nothing but the warp, are catalogued in libraries that are partly physical and partly exist in psychic dimensions that only those with sufficient sensitivity can navigate. The price of that knowledge is everything else: your freedom, your autonomy, your capacity to decide what to do with what you have learned. The ones who lack psychic gifts but survive the initial period of capture and adjustment become servants in the more conventional sense. They maintain the towers, prepare the materials for rituals, they run the 1,000 mundane logistics that keep even a demon world's elite society functioning. They are not abused in the random and reflexive way that Medringard's slaves are abused. The Thousand Sons are, in their way, rational. They understand that a broken servant is less useful than an intact one, that cooperation extracts more value than pure terror. But rationality on Sortiarius is not kindness, it is calculation, and calculations change. What makes Sortiarius genuinely terrifying, in ways that distinguish it from the other demon worlds we have visited, is the ambient quality of its supernatural environment. On Medringard, the horror is physical and industrial. On the Plague Planet, it is biological. On Sicarus, it is devotional. On Sortiarius, it is cognitive. The warp energy that saturates this world is Tzinchian in nature, which means it acts specifically on the mind. thoughts become unstable. Our perceptions develop inconsistencies. Dreams bleed into waking life in ways that are impossible to fully account for. Mild cases result in creative but unreliable thinking, flashes of insight that may or may not be genuine, a tendency to find connections and patterns whether they are real or not. Severe cases result in visions that cannot be distinguished from reality, paranoia that is not entirely unjustified, because on this world, some of the things you are paranoid about are genuinely there. Our personality drift as the warp begins to rewrite the edges of who you are. The Thousand Sons themselves are somewhat protected from these effects by their training and their psychic discipline. Their mortal servants are not. The average lifespan of a non-psychic servant on Sortiarius is difficult to establish because of the world's casual relationship with time, but reports suggest it is not long before the cumulative cognitive effects either drive them to some form of breakdown or integrate them more deeply into the world's psychic environment in ways that change them irreversibly or lead them to attempt escape. Some do escape, slipping away from their master's towers into the flux planes, joining the nomadic warbands of Zangors and escaped servants that move through the wastelands. Some of these warbands have existed for generations. Their leaders, individuals who have risen through raw competence and warp-touched talent to command the respect of other desperate people, are sometimes noticed by the Thousand Sons and recruited back into service, which is not entirely the irony it appears to be. On Sortiarius, escaping the tower is one of the tests. The ones who escape and survive and build something from nothing in the most hostile environment in the Eye of Terror are exactly the kind of people Magnus wants serving him. And above all of it, the Ring of Sortiarius. This is perhaps the single most arresting visual feature of the entire world. Like Saturn has its rings, Sortiarius has its ring, but not of ice or rock. The ring around Sortiarius is made of screaming souls, the spirits of those who died by deception, claimed specifically by Tzeentch, bound into an eternal orbit around the world that embodies their god's power. They are not merely present in some metaphysical sense. They are visible, and a shimmering band of light and sound that circles the world and can be perceived on the surface as a faint, constant wail, just at the edge of audibility, present in every moment of every day for everyone who lives on Sortiarius. It never stops. It cannot be ignored once you have become aware of it. And it is, in a very real sense, a reminder. This is what becomes of those who serve Tzeentch through deception, not peace, not oblivion, an eternity of orbit, of visibility, Atan, of being witnessed without being free. Drakasi, the gladiatorial civilization. Of all the demon worlds in the Eye of Terror, Drakasi might be the one that is easiest to comprehend from a distance and hardest to truly understand from close up. From a distance, it is simple, a cornate world, dedicated to violence, structured around gladiatorial games. That description is accurate. It is also missing almost everything important. Begin with the sea. Drakasi has a sea, which is unusual among demon worlds in the Eye. But it is not a sea of water. It is a sea of blood, not metaphorically, not blood-red water, but actual blood, warm and thick, and carrying on its surface the foam of something organic and alive. This sea connects the world's cities the way rivers and coastlines connect cities in more conventional geographies. The Sea of Blood is Drakasi's most prominent geographic feature, visible from orbit as a dark stain across the face of the world. And it is old enough that nobody currently living knows what the world looked like before it, or whether there was a before. The cities of Drakasi rise from the shores of this sea and from the inland plains, each one a distinct expression of the specific warlord or demon that claims it. What they all share is the arena. Every city on Drakasi has an arena, not a small one, arenas that are the architectural centerpieces of their cities, visible from anywhere within the city's boundaries, capable of seating enough witnesses to make the contests they host genuinely sacred acts of communal worship, rather than simple entertainment. because that is what gladiatorial combat is on Drakasi, worship. Every death in an arena is a skull for the blood god. Every contest, every demonstration of superior violence, every moment of physical domination sends something up through the warp to Horn, who does not care from whence the blood flows, but cares enormously that it flows, and flows freely, and flows with maximum force and fury behind it. The ruling class of Drakasi is one of the most diverse and strange bedfellow assemblages in the Eye of Terror. It includes Chaos Space Marines, warbands, and individual champions who have claimed territories and built power bases over centuries of competition. It includes barbarian chieftains, or mortal warriors who rose through the gladiatorial system to accumulate enough victories and enough followers to make their own bid for territorial control. It includes what can only be described as Amazon huntresses, all-female warrior orders whose specific mythology and spiritual practices are not entirely documented in imperial records, but whose combat effectiveness is. It includes demons, actual warp entities that have anchored themselves to the material world through the sustained sacrifice of the arenas and maintain a more or less permanent presence. It includes self-styled nobles, individuals who found that the best path to survival on Drakasi was to adopt the aesthetic of nobility rather than the substance, surrounding themselves with ceremony and ritual and the specific theatre of aristocratic behaviour, leveraging the psychological weight of that performance to achieve what they could not achieve through raw violence alone. All of them answer, ultimately, to Lord Ebondrake. Ebondrake is a demon prince, and his physical form reflects his name with a literalism that the Eye of Terror makes possible. He is reptilian, enormous, and the embodiment of what happens when the concept of a dragon is fed 10,000 years of war and devotion and allowed to grow into something that can reshape reality in its immediate vicinity. He runs the games. He sets the rules, insofar as Hornate rules can be said to exist, which is a genuine legal philosophy question on Drakasi, and he enforces them through the simple mechanism of being more powerful than anyone else present. His word is the final word, as not because he is beloved, but because he is unkillable by any force currently available on the world, and everyone knows it. Below the ruling class, the slave population of Drakasi is enormous. Every city is constantly acquiring new slaves, through raids into real space and into other parts of the Eye of Terror, through the capture of enemies in the endless territorial conflicts between the world's warlords, through the natural reproduction of the existing slave population. These slaves serve two primary functions. They work, agriculture, construction, maintenance of the cities and the seagoing vessels that connect them, and they fight. The arenas must be fed. Tens of thousands die every day across Drakasi's many arenas, and the supply must be maintained. What makes Drakasi's gladiatorial system genuinely distinctive from a simple slave-killing operation is the structure that has evolved around the best fighters. A slave who wins consistently enough, spectacularly enough, brutally enough, to draw the attention of the audience and the attention of the patrons who sponsor fighters in the arenas, begins to accumulate something. Not freedom, not exactly, but status, a name, recognition, sponsors who have an investment in the slaves' continued performance and who therefore have an interest in keeping them alive, training them, equipping them better than the standard arena issue. And with status comes a small but non-trivial degree of protection from the casual, random violence that consumes most of Drakasi's slave population. The most famous example of what can happen to an exceptional fighter in Drakasi's arenas is Justicar Alaric of the Grey Knights, a space marine of the most elite and specifically anti-demon chapter in the Imperium. Captured by the Cornat Duke, Venalitor, during the 13th Black Crusade and brought to Drakasi to fight, Alaric survived the arenas. It more than survived. He fought well enough that he attracted the notice of the Drakasi political structure, well enough that his presence became a factor in the ongoing power struggles between the world's ruling class. And eventually, through a combination of exceptional combatability, strategic patience, and a fundamental orientation toward purpose that the pure violence environment of Drakasi could not break. He engineered not just his own escape, but a slave revolt so well executed that it destabilized the world's entire political structure, triggering the civil war between the ruling warlords that was exactly what he needed to break free. In the caves and deep tunnels beneath Drakasi's cities, there is one more population worth noting: the Scephalids. They are not human. They are a xenos species, spider-like, apparently genuinely alien to this world rather than native to it, and discovered and subjugated by the Duke Venalitor and introduced into Horn's worship. They form the deepest slave class on Drakasi, doing the underground work that even human slaves are not tasked with, living in a darkness that even the most desperate human inhabitants of the surface would find intolerable. Their exact nature, their culture, their internal lives, their experience of their condition, almost nothing of this has been documented. They are defined entirely by their function in the records that survive. This is not unusual in the Warhammer universe, where the inner lives of the conquered and enslaved are routinely invisible. But it is worth noting, because their invisibility is itself a kind of statement about Drakasi and the specific values of the civilization that structures itself around the arena. On Drakasi, the only thing that makes you visible is your capacity for violence. But the only way to exist in a way that matters, that is acknowledged, that generates any interest from the powers that govern the world, is to kill well. The Scephalids apparently cannot do this in ways that appeal to cornate aesthetics. So they are underground, in the dark, invisible. Everything that cannot contribute to the arena is underground, in the dark, invisible. This is Drakasi's specific theology expressed as urban planning. What the psychology of the damned, what 10,000 years of chaos does to a mind. We have been walking through these worlds individually, spending time in their specific atmospheres. But there is a larger question that runs through all of them, and it deserves its own treatment. What does it actually do to a human mind to grow up on a demon world? Not to arrive there as a captive from the Imperium. That experience is genuinely horrifying and has been documented through the accounts of those rare individuals who survived it. But to be born there, to have it be the only reality you have ever known, the answer, pulled from everything the lore gives us about the mortal populations of demon worlds, is something that is simultaneously encouraging and deeply disturbing. Deeply disturbing first. The human mind adapts. This is one of its great strengths and one of its potentially catastrophic vulnerabilities. It can normalize almost anything, given enough time and complete enough immersion. Children born on the plague planet do not experience Nurgle's gifts as violations of the body. They experience them as the body. Children born on Sycharis do not experience the screaming of the sacrificed as horror. They experience it as ambient sound, background to their lives, as meaningless as traffic noise to someone raised in a city. Children born on Medrengard do not experience the black sun or the constant labor or the casual brutality of the Iron Warriors as exceptional. They experience it as weather, the specific conditions of the world, which is just how the world is. This adaptation is not merely cognitive, it is neurological, psychological, in some cases literally biological. As the ambient warp energy of demon worlds actively reshapes the bodies and nervous systems of those exposed to it from birth. On Sortiarius, the long-term mortal population develops psychic sensitivity as a near-universal trait, not because of any external gift, but because growing up in a saturated Tzeentchian environment quietly rewires the parts of the human mind that connect to the warp. On the plague planet, if the immune systems of native-born inhabitants perform functions that should be impossible, tolerating disease loads that would kill anyone else because the biology has been remade by generations of Nurgle's influence to treat those diseases as part of the self rather than invasions of it. There is also a specific cognitive effect that long exposure to demon worlds produces, documented in the fragmentary records of inquisitorial operatives who have studied captured demon world natives rather than simply executing them. A reorientation of the fundamental categories of moral reasoning, not the simple inversion of good and evil that the Imperium's propaganda about chaos suggests. Demon world natives are not cartoonishly evil do not think of themselves as evil, and often have elaborate ethical frameworks that are internally coherent and that serve genuine social functions within their communities. What changes is the baseline. What damage means, what loss means, what an acceptable outcome looks like. On Medrengard, a day that ends with you alive and at the same level of the hierarchy as you started, with no loved ones selected for experimentation, is a good day. This is not a corruption of the concept of a good day, as it is the concept of a good day calibrated against the specific reality of Medrengard's conditions, and in that context, it is both accurate and rational. The problem, from an imperial standpoint, is that someone operating with this calibration is going to make decisions that look incomprehensible from outside the context, because the framework producing those decisions is not the framework an imperial citizen would use. What this means at the psychological level, is that the mortal population of a demon world is not the population you would get if you simply took ordinary humans and put them in horrible conditions. They are a genuinely different kind of human being. Shaped from birth by the specific nature of their world, their values, desires, fears, and sense of what constitutes a good life are calibrated against an entirely different baseline. A Medrengard slave who has survived 50 years and achieved a relatively stable position in the workforce hierarchy is not secretly longing for the Imperium. The Imperium is an abstract concept to them at best, a threatening and alien idea at worst. What they want is what they have always wanted: to survive, to be less exposed than the people around them, to maintain whatever small advantages they have accumulated, to pass those advantages to their children. This is not a corruption of human desire. It is human desire operating in a specific context. Consider also the question of loyalty. On an ordinary world, loyalty is directed toward institutions: the emperor, the chapter, the regiment, the hive gang, the family. On a demon world, institutional loyalty still exists, but it is organized differently. On Medrengard, the relevant institution is the specific warsmith's household you belong to, because the warsmith is the entity that directly controls the conditions of your existence. Loyalty to Medrengard as a whole, or to the Iron Warriors as a legion, is too abstract to generate the kind of motivated, behaviorally consequential loyalty that shapes actual choices. What generates that is proximity and dependency, or the understanding that the specific power structure you are embedded in is the specific power structure that determines whether you eat today and whether your children are safe tonight. This localized, intensely personal form of loyalty is both more stable and more brittle than institutional loyalty. More stable because it is grounded in immediate concrete reality. More brittle because the specific person or structure you are loyal to can die, can change. It can reassign you to a different context with no warning. The encouraging part, and yes there is one, is related to the unfleshed, to Alaric fighting in Drakasi's arenas, to whatever the small flame of emperor worship meant in the wastes of Medrengard, maintained by beings that the universe had almost entirely unmade. There is something in the human character that resists even these conditions, that keeps reaching for something beyond the immediate, a something that transcends the specific cruelties of the environment, something that recognizes at some precognitive level that the conditions it lives in are not the only conditions that could exist. Not every member of every demon world's mortal population is a true believer. Some are performing. Some are working the minimum viable devotion to stay alive while keeping something of themselves back, hidden in some internal space that the world's psychic scrutiny cannot quite reach. This is extraordinarily dangerous on a demon world. The warp can literally smell insincerity in some cases. The demons that inhabit these worlds can perceive the specific psychic signature of hidden doubt. But some people manage it anyway. Some people find the gap between what they show and what they are, and they live in that gap for entire lifetimes. The slaves of Sikaris, who maintain their interior selves in the face of total external conformity. But the thrall wizards of Sortiarius, who absorb everything the Thousand Suns teach them and give back exactly what is required while keeping the conclusions they are reaching to themselves. The gladiators of Drakaasi, who perform the specific theatre of ferocity that the arena demands, while keeping the part of themselves that thinks strategically, carefully hidden from the crowd. These people are not heroes. They are not mounting resistance campaigns or secretly working toward liberation, but they are simply surviving with more of themselves intact than their environment would prefer. And in a universe as grim as the 41st Millennium, there is something worth noting in that. Not celebrating, not romanticizing, but noting, because it tells us that the specific human capacity for internal reservation, for keeping something back, is one of the things that even 10,000 years of demon world conditioning cannot fully eliminate. Wati, the path to power. How mortals rise on demon worlds. For those born without the imperial good fortune of having a chapter master or primarch to serve and advance under, the path to power in a demon world context is one of the most interesting and most dangerous careers available in the 41st Millennium. Because demon worlds, for all their horror, do offer something that the Imperium frequently does not, the possibility of genuine upward mobility. The possibility that a person born at the bottom of a cruel hierarchy can, through specific kinds of effort and specific kinds of sacrifice, end up somewhere very different from where they started. The mechanism is the attention of the Chaos Gods, and the process is called the Path of Chaos Champions. Every Chaos God requires its servants to prove themselves, and the proof takes different forms for different gods. For Khorne, it is kill counts and the quality of the violence, not just how many, but how impressively, how completely, how much genuine fury went into the act. For Nurgle, it is the endurance and the sharing, surviving things that should kill you, and then spreading those things to others as an act of love. For Tzeentch, it is cunning and complexity, schemes within schemes, the manipulation of events toward outcomes that demonstrate the magnitude of the intelligence doing the manipulating. For Slaanesh, it is the pursuit of sensation and the refinement of desire until ordinary experience is no longer sufficient and only the extreme margins of feeling can satisfy. What is important to understand about this process is that it is not a reliable career progression. It is not a ladder where each rung leads predictably to the next. It is more like a natural selection process, designed by a being that finds suffering aesthetically pleasing. The gods do not care about the mortals who fail to rise, as they care only about the ones who succeed, and they care about them specifically because those individuals have already demonstrated, through the act of surviving the selection, that they possess whatever quality the god values. Khorne does not mourn the warriors who die in the attempt to attract his attention. He harvests their skulls like anyone else's and moves on. The champion who survives is interesting, not because they were chosen from the beginning, but because they proved themselves unchosenable, proved themselves resistant to the things that claimed everyone around them. A mortal who achieves sufficient notice from their patron god receives a mark, a physical and spiritual change that both demonstrates their status within the patron's hierarchy and actively enhances them, granting capabilities that begin to push them beyond what ordinary human biology permits. The Mark of Khorne makes its bearer more ferocious in close combat and erases fear entirely, not as a psychological state, but as a biological response, the biochemistry of terror simply ceasing to operate in the way it does for ordinary people. The Mark of Nurgle grants resistance to damage and disease, and a kind of resilient, stolid endurance that outlasts things that should have destroyed it. But the Mark of Tzeentch bestows psychic gifts and an uncanny capacity for strategic insight, the sense of multiple possible futures, simultaneously visible and navigable. The Mark of Slaanesh enhances the senses and the body toward a kind of terrible perfection, superhuman speed and grace, and a perceptual richness that makes ordinary sensory experience feel like moving through fog. A marked champion begins to attract followers, and because on demon worlds status is visible, it carries a specific quality, a sense of power and protection that others can perceive and want to be near. This is not always rational, and it is not always safe, because a champion's followers are also potential rivals, potential assassins, potential offerings if the champion needs something to give their god to maintain favor. The social dynamics of a Chaos warband are among the most brutally complex interpersonal environments in fiction. Are a constant negotiation between the need for followers to be useful, the followers' need to advance themselves, and the overarching imperative of the god being served, who does not care about any of this except insofar as it produces the outcomes the god desires. The gifts keep coming, as long as the champion keeps proving worthy. Each gift is a mutation, an addition or modification to the body that makes the champion more capable in specific ways, but also pushes them further from the human baseline. A Cornate champion might develop the ability to enter a sustained battle rage that makes them essentially immune to pain. A Nurglite champion might develop an additional stomach that can process almost any biological material as food. A Metsentian champion might develop an additional eye that operates on psychic frequencies. A Slaneshi champion might develop additional nerve endings in every extremity, making them almost inhumanly sensitive to sensation of every kind. The problem, and this is the specific tragedy built into the path of every Chaos champion, is that these gifts accumulate. Each one is wonderful individually, but the human body was not designed to accommodate an indefinite number of wonderful modifications, and neither was the human psyche. At some point, if too many gifts arrive and the champion cannot maintain the internal coherence of their identity through all of them, the gifts stop being additions to a self and start being the replacement of that self. The mutations begin to take on a logic of their own, a pattern that has nothing to do with the champion's history or personality, and everything to do with the random creative energies of the god providing them. The champion stops guiding their own transformation and starts being transformed without input. And the end point of that process is Chaos spawn. The path leads, if the champion is successful, if they accrue enough specific victories and demonstrations of their god's specific values, while keeping enough of themselves intact to direct that accrual with intention, to one of two endpoints. The first is demonhood, the transformation of the champion into a demon prince, as a being of the warp who retains the tactical intelligence and personal identity of the human who began the journey, but expresses it through a form that is no longer constrained by human biology, psychology, or mortality. This is the prize. This is what every champion is ultimately climbing toward. The stories of how demon princes came to be are some of the most compelling in the 40k universe, each one a specific tragedy or triumph depending on your perspective. A human life pushed to its absolute limits, and then past them into something that is no longer human, but remembers being human, and has made a decision about what that memory means. The second endpoint, for the champion who accumulates too many mutations, or fails too many times, or simply runs out of the specific quality that their patron required, is Chaos spawn. The total loss of coherent form and identity. The mutations that have been accumulating become too much for any continuous self to organize around, and what remains is a mass of flesh and impulse that can barely be said to have a personality, only instinct and hunger, and the distant echo of a god's will, providing the most basic direction. Chaos spawn are both the warning and the shadow that walks alongside every champion. They are what you might become if you reach too far and grasp nothing. On Demon World specifically, that this path to power is compressed and accelerated by the ambient warp energy of the environment. The mutations come faster. The attention of the gods is more easily attracted because the psychic signal-to-noise ratio is different inside the eye. You do not have to shout as loudly to be heard. This means that demon worlds produce champions at a rate that real space never could. And it means that the life expectancy of those champions, and once they begin attracting the wrong kind of notice from rivals who also want what they have, is correspondingly short. Demon worlds are not just terrible places to live. They are also breeding grounds for exactly the kind of catastrophic individuals who then raid out into the galaxy, looking for more to conquer, more to destroy, more to offer to their patron gods. The cycle is self-sustaining. Demon worlds produce champions. Champions take followers and go raiding. Raids produce captives who end up on Daemon worlds. Captives adapt to Daemon worlds and eventually produce champions. The Eye of Terror is not merely a wound in space. It is a machine for making monsters, and the fuel for that machine is ordinary human desperation in an environment that offers no ordinary human options. Death on a Daemon world. What happens when your body fails? On an ordinary world, death is, if nothing else, definitive. Your body stops functioning. The chemical processes that sustain consciousness cease, and whatever philosophical position you hold about what comes after, the practical reality is that the specific biological entity you were stops interacting with the physical universe. This is not great, but it is clean in a way that Demon World death is not. Because on a Demon World, the warp is present, and the warp is the dimension where souls go when bodies stop. Under normal circumstances, as in the galaxy away from warp rifts and demon worlds, the soul's passage into the Imperium after death is brief and difficult to track. Various entities in the warp consume it, or it dissipates, or the Emperor's psychic pull draws it toward whatever lies beyond the Golden Throne. None of this is comfortable, but it is transient. On a demon world, the soul does not get to dissipate. The warp is too present, too concentrated, too much under the active control of entities with specific plans for the energy that mortal souls represent. When you die on Medrengard, when your body gives out in the demon forges or on the construction scaffolding or in one of the underground chambers, the black sun feeds on what you were. This is not a metaphor used by Iron Warriors propaganda. It is a literal description of a process that the ambient environment performs, or the remnant of your consciousness and your emotional history being absorbed into the psychic architecture of the world, feeding the specific quality of Medrengard's atmosphere. On the Plague Planet, death is the beginning of Nurgle's deepest gift. The body decays into the soil, feeding the organisms that will eventually become part of some future organism. The material cycling through the world in the great recursive process that Nurgle values above almost everything else. And the soul is more complex. Nurgle is a god of cycles, of the transition from one state to another, and those who have given themselves genuinely to his service are incorporated into his garden in the Imperium, in ways that are not straightforwardly pleasant, but which are not, from Nurgle's perspective, an ending. They persist, transformed, serving the cycle in a new form. This is, in the context of the alternatives available to souls in the 41st millennium, arguably not the worst outcome, which is damning with faint praise, but that is the best the Plague Planet has to offer. On Sycharis, the fate of souls depends on the degree and sincerity of their devotion. Those who have served the Word-Bearer's vision of chaos, undivided with genuine faith, are claimed by the gods they served, their souls entering the currents of the Immaterium in whatever form those gods find useful. But the bodies of fallen Dark Apostles are buried in Sycharis's holy soil, the accumulated layers of the world's dead, compressed beneath centuries of architectural weight, a psychically charged stratum of former believers that is said to make the Basilica of the Word literally more powerful, more capable of serving as a conduit between the mortal plane and the warp, because of all the faith buried beneath its foundations. Arthos Sortiarius has perhaps the most visually explicit reminder of what awaits souls on a demon world. The Ring. Those who die by deception on a Tsentian world are condemned to the Ring, to the eternal orbit, visible to every person on the surface every day. This is not an accident of warp geography. It is deliberate. It is Tsentia's specific commentary on the relationship between the Changer of Ways and those who thought they could play his game and win. But the Ring is a warning and a spectacle simultaneously, which is very much how Tzeentch operates. On Drakasi, the deaths in the arenas feed Khorne directly. This is the explicit purpose of the arena system, to provide the blood god with the maximum quantity of blood and skulls in the most concentrated and devoted way possible. A death in Drakasi's arenas is not just a death, it is a sacrifice, a tithe, a transaction in the only currency Khorne accepts. What happens to the souls of those who die this way is not extensively documented, but the general cornate theology suggests they enter a realm of endless battle. Not a reward in any sense a mortal would recognize, but a continuation of the only state Horn values in his servants. Blood continues to flow. The battle does not end. The skull is added to the throne. Or what this means for the psychic weight of demon worlds, for the specific quality of the dread they generate in any sensitive entity that approaches them, is that they are not merely planets with bad conditions. They are planets where the boundary between what is happening now and what happened in the past does not exist in the conventional sense. Every person who has died on Medrengard is in some sense still there, still feeding the black sun. He is still contributing to the psychic atmosphere that newcomers feel pressing on their minds. Every believer buried in Sicarus's soil is still worshipping, still contributing their faith to the structures above them. Every gladiator who died in Drakasi's arenas is still part of the arena's specific psychic resonance, the accumulated blood energy of 10,000 years of organized slaughter still present in the stone and the sand and the air. Demon worlds are not haunted, but haunting implies a past that cannot quite let go. Demon worlds are something more total than haunted. They are continuous with their past, which is to say, the past never fully ended on them, and the dead are not gone but integrated. And the suffering of every generation that has come before is still present in the fabric of the world itself. This quality, the non-separation of past and present, the accumulation of suffering into something that becomes literally structural, is one of the things that makes demon worlds feel different from other dangerous places in the 40k universe even before you have seen any of the specific horrors they contain. There is a weight to them, a psychic thickness. Inquisitors and psychers who have survived proximity to demon worlds consistently report the sensation before they have any direct contact with the world's surface. A pressure, a density, and a sense of layers upon layers of experience compressed into the ambient environment. This is not imagination. The layers are real. The compression is real. 10,000 years of intense human suffering, every moment of which was feeding the psychic ecology of a warp-saturated world, have produced an environment so dense with accumulated experience that it resists the present tense, that being there, inside it, makes it difficult to maintain the clear sense of being a distinct individual moving through a neutral environment, because the environment is not neutral and has not been neutral for a very long time. What this means for the new captive brought to a demon world for the first time, the Imperial citizen, the guardsman, the Chaos Marine from a real space warband who has not grown up inside the eye, is a disorientation that goes beyond the visual horror of what they are seeing. And it is the disorientation of a person who has walked into a building that has been inhabited by intense human experience for centuries and can feel that history pressing on them from the walls, but amplified by several orders of magnitude, amplified by the warp, amplified by the specific intention of the demon entity that has shaped the world to produce exactly this effect in anyone who is not yet calibrated to it. The ones who survive, who adapt, who eventually stop feeling that weight and start feeling it as simply the air they breathe. They do not lose the sensitivity that made them feel it in the first place. They simply integrate it, become part of it, join the accumulated layers that the next captive will feel pressing in from the walls. This is the deepest sense in which demon worlds claim their inhabitants, not through violence, not through mutation, not even through the specific corruptions of chaos doctrine, but through the simple, total, irreversible act of making you part of the place. Once the weight feels like home, you can never fully leave. Even the ones who escape physically carry something of it with them, some quality in the way they experience reality, some calibration of their nervous system to conditions that exist nowhere in the ordinary galaxy, that never quite returns to what it was before they arrived. You can escape a demon world. You cannot fully escape having been on one. As survival stories, the ones who held on. Given everything we have discussed, it is worth asking whether anyone on a demon world can be said to survive in any meaningful sense. Not survive physically. Plenty of people survive physically on these worlds, living out long lives of brutal adaptation. But survive as recognizably human beings, maintaining something of who they were or who they might have become under different circumstances? The answer is yes, and the cases are instructive. On Medrengard, there is the example of the unfleshed already mentioned, mutant creatures that the world had every reason to consume entirely, who instead built community, maintained hierarchy, organized around protecting their weakest members rather than exploiting them, and reached for the divine through crude effigies assembled from the wreckage of their making. In a world where the Iron Warrior's entire aesthetic is organized around the idea that the strong take and the weak serve, does the unfleshed had quietly built something organized around an entirely different principle? They did not survive in terms of living comfortable lives. They survived in the sense that the thing that makes human beings human, the capacity for community, for protection of the vulnerable, for reaching upward towards something that transcends the immediate, was not extinguished in them even by the most literal possible act of dehumanization. On Drakasi, our Justicar Alaric represents something different. Not the preservation of ordinary human values in a damaged form, but the effective deployment of every specialized capability he possessed in a context that was specifically designed to prevent such deployment. The arena system of Drakasi is optimized for one thing: the production of spectacularly violent death. Alaric was trained for an entirely different thing: the prosecution of war against supernatural evil, through a combination of martial excellence, strategic intelligence, and a specific quality of faith that the Grey Knights require and cultivate above all else. These two things interacted in ways that Drakasi's power structure did not anticipate. The lesson, such as it is, has nothing to do with heroism or even human goodness. It has to do with the way that specialized capability, if deployed carefully in an environment that does not understand it, can produce outcomes that neither party would predict. The thrall wizards of Sortiarius who managed to maintain their interior selves are the quietest of these cases and perhaps the most philosophically interesting. Because what they were doing, absorbing knowledge, performing service, as presenting a surface of compliance while keeping a genuine self somewhere underneath, is essentially the strategy that every creative and sensitive person in an authoritarian system has ever used. Comply externally. Maintain internally. Give what is demanded. Keep what is essential. It is not resistance. It is not heroism. It is simply the exercise of the basic human capacity for having an interior life that is not fully accessible to outside scrutiny, and deployed in the most extreme environment that capacity has ever been tested in. None of these are stories with happy endings. The unfleshed were eventually caught between forces neither they nor the world they had made for themselves could resist. Alaric escaped Drakasi, yes, but at a cost, and into a universe that was still the same grim darkness. The thrall wizards of Sortiarius are still there, still bound, the quality of their survival invisible to everyone around them. But survival of the soul, in the Warhammer universe, has never been a guarantee of survival of the body, and it has never promised a good outcome for the specific person doing the surviving. It is simply itself, the fact of being more intact than the environment intended, which in a universe where the environment has specific and catastrophic intentions for you, is not nothing. Have the Eye of Terror as ecosystem. How demon worlds interact. It would be a mistake to think about Daemon worlds in isolation from each other, as if each one were a hermetically sealed pocket of suffering with no relationship to what surrounds it. The Eye of Terror is not a collection of separate horror exhibits. It is an ecosystem, a vast, chaotic, deeply unstable ecosystem, but an ecosystem nonetheless. And the demon worlds within it are connected to each other in ways that shape what each of them is and how each of them functions. The first and most fundamental connection is trade. This may sound strange, and in a conventional sense, it should be impossible. How do you establish reliable trade routes in a region of space where the laws of physics do not apply consistently? Where a journey that takes 3 days one way might take 3 centuries on the return trip, where the ships that traverse the eye are crewed by people who have either made peace with the possibility of temporal dislocation or are simply not aware of it. The answer is that you develop practices and institutions specifically adapted to those conditions. And over 10,000 years, the inhabitants of the Eye of Terror have done exactly that. There are navigators, not navigators in the imperial sense, not psyker-born humans with the warp eye and the specific genetic gift, but people who have developed, through experience and mutation, and the kind of deep familiarity with the warp's patterns that only comes from a lifetime of exposure, the ability to read the eye's shifting currents and make informed guesses about which route will get you where you are trying to go and roughly when you will arrive. The second connection is political. The demon worlds of the Eye of Terror are not each other's allies. They are, in most cases, rivals and competitors. They're ruling entities engaged in the kind of status competitions and territorial disputes that powerful beings with enormous egos and essentially unlimited time have been engaging in since the beginning of the Eye's existence. But rivalry is a relationship. The demon worlds know about each other. They monitor each other. And they raid each other. Not just real space, not just the Imperium, but their neighbors in the Eye. The captives brought back from raids on other demon worlds often carry valuable intelligence about those worlds' layouts, political structures, and vulnerabilities. And the occasional alliance between demon worlds when a specific opportunity requires cooperation. Sound is also real. The great Black Crusades that have periodically broken out of the Eye and crashed against the Imperium's defenses have required at least temporary coordination between entities that spend most of their time in competition. The third connection is psychic. The Eye of Terror is a region of space that is continuously saturated with warp energy, and that energy carries information in ways that ordinary space does not. Now, the emotional climate of one demon world can affect the ambient psychic environment of nearby worlds, especially when large-scale events are happening. A major battle, a significant demonic summoning, the death of a demon prince. Think of it as a kind of slow-moving psychic weather, where the specific character of the storm depends on which gods are dominant in the area and what is currently happening at the epicenter. That the inhabitants of demon worlds experience this as a shift in the quality of their world's ambient conditions. Not dramatic, usually. Not the sudden appearance of new rules, but a subtle change in the intensity of the world's specific qualities. Medrengard becomes slightly more oppressive than usual. The plague planet's diseases become slightly more virulent. Sikaris's prayers grow slightly louder. These fluctuations are noticed and interpreted by the religious and the politically astute. They worked into existing belief systems as signs and portents, and they sometimes accurately predict large-scale shifts in the Eye's political situation. The fourth and most human connection is population movement. People move through the Eye of Terror. Not often, not easily, not safely, but they move. Escaped slaves who survive in the wilderness of one demon world long enough to stow away on a vessel bound for somewhere else. Adventurers from real space who have entered the Eye either by accident or by deliberate and probably catastrophic choice and are now trying to navigate out. Merchants who have accepted the risks of trading with the Eye's inhabitants because the potential rewards are large enough and their alternatives limited enough. Renegades from the Imperium, from Chaos warbands, from Xenos civilizations that border the Eye's region of influence. All of these people move. And as they move, they carry information, culture, and, perhaps most importantly, hope in the form of evidence that it is possible to be somewhere other than where you are. The existence of other worlds, even other demon worlds, even other terrible places, establishes a category, elsewhere. And the existence of elsewhere, even as a purely theoretical concept, is one of the few things that keeps certain minds from the total closure that their environments seem to demand. The Cadian Gate, the single most strategically significant point in the Eye of Terror's relationship with the wider galaxy, is relevant here too. Before the 13th Black Crusade, before Abaddon shattered Cadia, the gate was the primary choke point through which the Eye's forces had to pass to reach the heart of the Imperium. This meant that the demon worlds nearest to the gate were also the worlds most directly involved in the planning and staging of major chaos incursions. Sycharis, for example, is deeply implicated in the logistics of multiple Black Crusades. The Word-bearers use it as a launching point, and the Dark Apostles of the Dark Council have been involved in the political negotiations that precede every major coordinated assault. This proximity to the Gate has shaped Sycharis's culture in ways that distinguish it from worlds deeper in the eye. It has a more outward-looking orientation than Sortiarius or the Plague Planet, a greater investment in events happening in real space, and a political culture that cares about the wider 40,000 universe in a way that worlds which have been essentially turned entirely inward do not. After the destruction of Cardia, the Eye of Terror expanded. The Astronomicon flickered. The Great Rift tore across the galaxy, and the relationship between the demon worlds inside the Eye and the galaxy they had been pressing against changed fundamentally. Not just for the Imperium, Earth which now faced chaos threats from every direction, instead of primarily from one, but for the demon worlds themselves. Worlds that had been relatively insulated from direct interaction with real space now found themselves at new boundaries. Worlds that had been nodes in a network now found that network rearranged. The specific political geographies that had structured Eye of Terror power dynamics for 10,000 years are no longer entirely intact. What this means for the mortal inhabitants of demon worlds, for the slaves on Medrengard, the believers on Sycharis, the gladiators on Drakasi, is not entirely clear even from the perspective of 40k's current narrative. But the possibility that the expansion of the warp has brought new captives, new resources, new chaos, and new cruelties to worlds that were already operating at their full capacity for horror is difficult to dismiss.
Worked out what it all means. The demon world as mirror. We have been in these places for a long time now, walking through environments so different from anything ordinary human experience offers that it might feel like we have been in pure fiction, in places that exist only in the imagination and have nothing to do with anything recognizable. I want to push back on that slightly, because I think one of the things that makes Daemon worlds such compelling lore is precisely that they are not pure fantasy.
Are the basic mechanics of a demon world, an environment shaped by the desires and obsessions of a single powerful entity, maintained by the collective belief and suffering of its inhabitants, generating a social structure whose entire purpose is to serve the needs of those at the top at the expense of those at the bottom, and doing all of this in a way that, over enough time and with enough immersion, those at the bottom come to experience as natural and correct. This is not an alien concept. At the extreme, supernatural versions of these things are unique to Warhammer, but the underlying structure is a recognizable shape. What 40k does with demon worlds, at its best, is take that recognizable shape and amplify it past every constraint that reality imposes on it. The constraints of physical law, of biology, of the basic fact that real societies require a minimum of cooperation and consent to function. And ask, what does this look like when nothing is holding it back? When the entity at the top is literally a god and can literally reshape the world to express its preferences. When the inhabitants cannot leave, cannot appeal to any external authority, cannot call for rescue. What does human life look like under those conditions? The answer, as we have seen, is complicated. It is not simply terrible, and it is not simply heroic. It is a specific, detailed, a particular kind of existence that retains some things that seem fundamental to humanity and loses others, that produces both the unfleshed and the Daemoncolaba, both Alaric and the gladiatorial system that required both his suffering and his excellence. It is full of people who are doing their best in conditions that were never designed with their welfare in mind, and full of people who are collaborating enthusiastically in the production of those conditions, and full of people who are something in between, which is perhaps the most human thing about it. The demon worlds of Warhammer 40,000 are terrible places. They are meant to be, but they are terrible in ways that are specific, detailed, elaborated, and in their elaboration, they become something that is not just horror, but genuine world building. environments with their own internal logics, their own histories, yet their own ways of producing the kinds of people who then walk out into the wider galaxy and change it. Medrengard makes a specific kind of warrior. The Plague Planet makes a specific kind of believer. Sicarus makes a specific kind of devotee. Sortiarius makes a specific kind of scholar. Drakasi makes a specific kind of fighter. These are not identical. The chaos they serve is not identical. And understanding the differences, understanding what each specific environment produces and why, is one of the genuine pleasures of digging deep into 40k lore. It is also worth sitting with what the existence of these worlds says about the universe in which they exist. The Warhammer 40,000 universe is sometimes criticized for being relentlessly bleak, for offering no redemptive possibilities, for staging its drama in a setting where nothing anyone does makes the fundamental situation any better. That criticism has some merit when applied lazily. But when it comes to Demon World specifically, I think the bleakness is doing something more interesting than simple nihilism. It is asking a genuine question. What would a universe look like in which the forces that damage human beings and human societies operated without the constraints that usually limit them in reality? Without the pragmatic necessity of keeping the exploited alive enough to keep being useful? Without the dissipating effects of time and geography and competing power structures? What would the endpoint look like? And the answer that the demon worlds provide is not chaos in the everyday sense of random, directionless disorder. It is the opposite, an extreme kind of order. Medrengard is ruthlessly organized. The Plague Planet has its seasons and its ritual calendar. Sicarus has its hierarchy and its liturgy. Sortiarius has its research programs and its academic competitions. Drakasi has its games and its rankings and its elaborate system for determining social status. These are not formless hellscapes. They are civilizations, monstrous ones, defined by the interests of entities that do not care whether their human inhabitants flourish, but civilizations nonetheless, complete with their own aesthetics, their own histories, their own internal politics. The horror is not the chaos. The horror is that the order is organized against you, and it is very good at it. And it has had 10,000 years to optimize. There is also, for those who appreciate it, a genuine philosophical argument running underneath all the grim-dark surface of these worlds. The 4 chaos gods represent 4 things that are real and present in human experience: violence and the desire to dominate, decay and the desire to endure, knowledge and the desire to understand and control, sensation and the desire to feel fully alive. None of these things are wrong in themselves. While what makes demon worlds terrible is not that these drives exist, but that they have been freed from every counterbalancing influence and allowed to operate at maximum intensity without limitation, without the corrective pressure of competing values, without the reality check that mortality and vulnerability usually provide. The galaxy-spanning 40k setting is full of beings that have achieved something like immunity from ordinary consequence. And Daemon worlds are the environments that result when those beings express themselves without restraint. What this suggests about the importance of limitation, of vulnerability, of the counterbalancing forces that ordinary existence imposes even on the powerful, is worth thinking about. The last word. We have walked a long way today, through the black sun shadow of Medrengard, where the white sky bleaches everything of color, and the Iron Warrior's demon engines grind through corridors that have not seen genuine sunlight in 10,000 years. Through the miasmic valleys of the Plague Planet and the thick, sweet-sick air that fills them. The disease villages and their residents who greet each new symptom as a form of grace. Through the buried levels of Sicarus, where the prayers never stop and the construction never stops. And somewhere in a temple that no one alive has seen, a Primarch meditates on the nature of faith itself, through the storms of Sortiarius, where the ring of screaming souls circles overhead, and the library towers hold knowledge that could remake the universe, and probably shouldn't. Through the sea of blood on Drakasi, where every city has an arena, and every death is a tithe, and the only ladder to climb is made from other people's bones. What I want to leave you with is not the horror, though the horror is real, and it is earned, and it is part of what makes these places compelling. What I want to leave you with is the scope. The sheer scale of the Warhammer 40,000 setting means that somewhere in the galaxy right now, in the fiction's present tense, all of this is happening simultaneously. While the arenas on Drakasi are running, the construction cranes on Sicarus are moving, a freshly awakened thrall wizard on Sortiarius is pressing their fingers against a book that might contain the secret of their own freedom and is being watched by something that knows exactly what they are thinking. The slave population of Medringard is building walls that they know how to collapse and wondering if they will ever get the chance. Yet a child born on the plague planet this morning is going to live their entire life believing that what they see and smell and feel every day is simply the world, and they will be right. And they will also be, from any other perspective, in the most extreme of circumstances possible. The 40k universe asks you to hold all of this at once, the grandeur and the misery, the cosmic scale and the individual human detail, and the space marines who stride through demon worlds as agents of whatever version of humanity they serve, and the mortals who live in those worlds between visits from anyone capable of striding. It is a setting that was built for war games, for miniature battles on tabletops, and it has grown into something that supports this kind of depth. Worlds with enough specificity that you can ask what daily life looks like for their inhabitants and get real considered. But detailed answers from decades of lore. That is remarkable. For all its excess and its darkness and its willingness to go to places that other fictional universes politely decline to visit, the 40k setting has built something genuinely vast and genuinely coherent. And demon worlds are some of the places where that coherence is most visible, because they are the places where the setting's rules operate without any of the moderating factors that normally soften them. Well, they are the universe in its purest form, and staring at them long enough tells you something real about the kind of universe this is. If you found this exploration worthwhile, if you spent this time with me in these dark places and came out the other end wanting to think more carefully about the corners of 40k that do not always get this kind of attention, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Every comment, every subscription, and every share with someone you think might appreciate this kind of deep lore dive helps keep this work possible. There is much more to explore. The Eye of Terror contains hundreds of worlds, each with its own specific history and its own specific flavor of impossible existence, and we have only touched 5 of them today. There are the feral worlds of chaos, where no traitor legion rules, and the populations have reverted to states so primitive that the warp has become their religion in its rawest form. There are the forge worlds claimed by the Dark Mechanicum, where the fusion of demon and machine produces technologies that the Imperium's own tech priests can barely conceive of. There are the maiden worlds that chaos has touched, where the Eldar's surviving nature spirits war against encroaching demonic influence in slow, centuries-long battles that leave the landscape permanently scarred. We have not gone to any of these places yet. Until next time, rest easy. After all, we are back in real space. The stars are the right color. The shadows fall in the right direction. And no one is listening to your thoughts unless you tell them. Stay safe out there in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. And maybe, just maybe, be glad that the Eye of Terror is a long, long way away. But be glad the stars look the way they should. Be glad that when the wind moves through your window at night, it is only the wind. In the 41st millennium, that kind of gladness is rare. Hold on to it.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.